Skinner, Smythe, Solorio, Swanson, Torres, Valadeo, Wagner, Wykowski, Williams, Yamada. Mr. Speaker.
A quorum is present. We ask our guests and visitors in the rear of chambers and in the gallery to please stand for the morning's prayer. We ask our Assembly Chaplain, Father Constantine Papadimos, to offer the day's prayer.
Let us pray. Lord, time is the most valuable commodity we have in life, even more valuable than money. After all, we can make more money, but we can't make more time. Lord, you give us each day as a gift. Help us to make the most of the time you give us by casting off any self-pity or disappointments of the past. Use us this day for your purposes and keep us on the path you have set. Amen.
We ask our guests and visitors to remain standing and join us in the flag salute. Join Assemblymember Wajkowski as he leads us in the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated. Reading of the previous day's journal.
Assembly Chamber, Sacramento, Thursday, January 12, 2012. The Assembly met at 7 a.m. The Honorable William W. Monning, Assembly Member, 27th District, presiding. Chief Clerk E. Dotson Wilson at the desk. Reading Clerk Timothy Moreland reading. Following were placed upon the morning roll call. 75, Bashadji and
Mr. Allen moves. Mr. Hagman seconds that the readings of the previous day's journal be dispensed with. Presentation of petitions, there are none. Introduction and references of bills will be deferred. Reports of committees will be deemed read and amendments deemed adopted. Messages from the Governor, there are none. Messages from the Senate, there are none. Motions and resolutions. The absences for the day will be deemed read and printed in the journal. Mr. Allen.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to suspend Assembly Rule 45.5 to allow Assemblymember Brownlee to have guests and photographers on the floor.
Without objection.
I also request unanimous consent to suspend Assembly Rule 45.5 to allow Assembly members Alejo, Fuentes, Galgiani, Monning, Skinner, and Williams to speak on adjourned in memory today.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, at the request of the author, please return the following bill to the Senate for further action. File Item 10, AB 41 Hill.
Without objection, Clerk will note.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the request of the authors and pursuant to Assembly Rule 78, I'm giving a one-day notice of intent to remove the following bills from the inactive file. File Item A4, AB 43 Monning.
Without objection, the clerk will note.
Yes. And as announced Monday, today will be the strike removed from the Governor's veto messages from the file. At the request of the authors, I request unanimous consent to strike all the Governor's veto messages from the daily file, except for File Item 48, AB 306 Gatto. The file numbers are 11 through 47, and file items 49 through 68.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Ms. Brownlee, you are recognized at my desk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, it's my great privilege today to honor Jerry Shelton, who has just retired from the Assembly after serving many years as Chief Consultant of the Committee on Education. He is up there in the gallery. As chairwoman of the Education Committee, I have worked very closely and have spent many hours with Jerry, tapping him for his deep knowledge of California's complex education code and school finance system. He is truly one of only a handful of experts in the state who understand really every corner of education policy. My predecessor on the committee, former Assemblyman Gene Mullen, also was equally as fortunate as I have been to be well served by Jerry as Chief Consultant. And Gene shares with me the same very deep respect for Jerry as a teacher, a mentor, a policy expert, and most importantly, simply just a real, true, quality human being. Jerry arrived in the Assembly with 15 years of experience in the Department of Education, working directly under State School Superintendents Delane Easton and Jack O'Connell. He also served as Chief Financial Officer for the department during the development of many, many state budgets. Prior to serving in government, Jerry taught economics for 14 years as an associate professor at UC Davis, specializing in state and local government finance and public policy. Jerry will end his career working as Vice President of Education Policy at School Innovations and Advocacy. I'm sorry his current position doesn't allow him to be standing right here on the floor, but he is up there in the gallery, and it is a great privilege to honor him today. He has also left us with a very special gift. His daughter, Misa, who works for Assemblymember Amiano's office, is still with us, and his other daughter, Mieko, is expecting a child soon and is about to make Jerry and his wife, Sharon, proud grandparents for the first time. Please join me in thanking and honoring Jerry for his many, many years of public service for the state of California. It is a great privilege to honor him.
Ms. Brownlee, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is also my great privilege to honor my former Chief of Staff, Wendy Notzena, who has worked behind the scenes in the legislature for nearly 30 years. I have relied on Wendy and her skills in overseeing my Capitol staff, coordinating with my district office staff, and advising me on legislative, policy, budget, and administrative and constituent activities. She was always there for me whenever I needed her. And I was very fortunate in persuading her to return to the Assembly to work for me in 2009 after she had taken a job 2 years earlier with CalPERS as their Chief of the Office of Governmental Affairs. Wendy left for CalPERS after serving for 6 years as Chief of Staff to Assemblymember Jackie Goldberg, who, like me, also served as Chairwoman of the Assembly Committee on Education, and also shares with me that very deep respect for Wendy and her overall acumen. She knows everything about this building and how things work, and she, too, is a real quality human being. Wendy got her start in the Assembly in 1981, and during her years here, she's had the pleasure of serving with Assembly members Art Torres, Johan Claes, Susan Davis, and the late Senator and former Assemblyman Herschel Rosenthal. She is highly respected among staff here, not only for freely sharing her expertise in legislative and political matters, but also for her many hours of volunteer work for the Asian Pacificer Islander Legislative Caucus Institute, the Women's Leadership Program of Leadership California, the Asian Pacific Youth Leadership Program, and many others. Wendy is known for generously providing many lunches and dinners for the younger members of her staff, particularly the fellows who put in so many hours at a very modest pay. Her sense of humor kept them balanced in the office, especially during those all-night and sometimes tense legislative sessions. Following in Wendy's footsteps, her son Curtis, who works as senior legislative aide in Assemblyman Amiano's office, and her other son, Anthony, works in the arts. Please again join me in extending best wishes for Wendy in her retirement as she travels the world, visits each Indian casino in Northern California, and enjoys many, many hours with her beloved husband, Walter. Please give Wendy a great hand for her service to California.
Mr. Amiano.
Yes, just briefly, I want to join in this well-deserved tribute, especially because I owe both Mr. Shelton and Wendy, Ms. Natane, a debt of gratitude for providing me with two of the best legislative aides in the building. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Members, we will now move to the Assembly observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday by taking up a special resolution. Without objection, we'll move to file item number 74. Mr. Bradford, are you ready to proceed in this item? Before you do, Mr. Bradford, the clerk will read.
Assembly concurred Resolution 87 by Assemblymember Bradford and others relative to Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Mr. Bradford, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I rise today to introduce ACR 87, which will commemorate and memorialize the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and celebrate his birthday on January 17th here in the state of California. I am honored to introduce this resolution, understanding the impact that Dr. King has had, not just on my life, but all of our lives, not only in California, not only in this United States, but throughout the world. We know him as a civil rights icon, a world leader, but Dr. King only viewed himself as a simple Southern Baptist preacher. That's all he ever wanted to be, and in essence, that's all he ever was. But he preached to the largest congregation that existed, and that was mankind, the world. He was inspired by Gandhi, the nonviolence approach that he took in every step of his life. He was inspired by his Christian faith. In 1963, he led what is now known as the historical March on Washington, which was really about freedom and jobs. And over a 250,000 people gathered on the Washington Monument to hear the famous speech of "I Have a Dream." But I stand here and I submit to you, it's more than a dream for Dr. King. It was a reality of bringing justice and equality and opportunity to all people, not just African American people. As I stand here today on the floor and I look at the diversity that exists here today, it's because of the fights that Dr. King did. He fought during the 50s and the 60s to make sure that equal opportunity existed. The Montgomery bus boycott afforded not just African Americans the right to board a bus, but all folks the right to board the bus, that African Americans no longer had to sit at the rear of the bus. They can assume any seat. And now it also moved toward international, interstate transportation, which allowed African Americans to board buses throughout the United States. He received a Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 35. And he gave the money away to the movement. He would not take the prize money that he received. The only thing that he kept was the watch, because he said, I didn't want worldly possessions. That wasn't what I was about. It was about moving the agenda of all people. In 1965, Congress passed the Voters' Rights Act because of Dr. King's leadership, eliminating the remaining barriers of voting for African Americans. And by 1965, over a quarter million of new black voters were registered. By 1966, only 4 out of 13 southern states had fewer than 50% of African Americans registered to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was readopted and strengthened in 1970, 1975, and 1982. And it's somewhat ironic that we deal with this issue today, because there are states now in 2012 who want to turn back the right to vote for people of color in this state. And I know Dr. King would not want that to be. He led the Poor People's Campaign, which assembled a multiracial coalition for impoverished Americans. But his most iconic fight was for the end of the Vietnam War. And I'm pretty sure today he would have the same passion of ending the war in Afghanistan and bringing our men and women home today. I stand here today asking you to join me in recognizing this world leader, this civil rights icon, a great man for all humanities. I ask for aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to acknowledge the phenomenal gift that the Speaker shared with us all today. In the words of Dr. King, the trumpet of conscience, and just wanted to share briefly, reading to the record, a quote included in the foreword by Marian Wright Edelman, because I think they're words that are most poignant and relevant today when we as legislators are facing our own war on poverty, if you will, and clearly need a movement on these same area. Permission to read, Mr. Speaker?
Without objection.
Thank you very much. In the words of Dr. King, if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend our race, our tribe, our class, and our nation. And this means we must develop a world perspective. No individual can alone. No nation can live alone. And as long as we try, the more we are going to have war in this world. Now the judgment of God is upon us, and we must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are all going to perish together as fools. I ask for an aye vote.
Thank you. Mr. Amiano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. It's always an honor to stand up and speak to the recognition of the contribution of MLK, particularly as a member of the LGBT caucus. Homophobia and racism kind of serve the same master, keeping people subjugated, but mostly keeping them apart. And I'm very, very proud to report that over the years, the division between the two communities has been exposed for what it is, more or less of a divide and conquer, and that the African American community welcomes and embraces their LGBT members, as well as the LGBT community, making sure that inclusivity is part and parcel of our political reform and our social justice measure. Together we're quite a force. And I recently attended a dinner for the Black AIDS Coalition, and this is a prominent and significant issue for both communities, and working together, I am sure that we will have beneficial legislation as well as change of attitudes towards a disease that decimated both communities, and through neglect and through mindset. And again, I salute MLK, and I know there's a tendency when someone has been gone to look at them and say, well, I think this is how they would feel or not feel. So I'm going to take a little liberty here, and I think MLK would probably be a 49ers fan. Thank you.
Mr. Ng.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. First of all, I want to commend the California Legislative Black Caucus for the extremely well-attended and inspirational breakfast of the other morning, as well as the Speaker's very, very passionate comments. As a member of and on behalf of the Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus, I too rise in support of this very significant resolution. I join all of you in celebrating the historical contributions of Martin Luther King Jr., a remarkable community leader. And unlike many holidays that we celebrate in California and America, many of us remember when Martin Luther King walked the earth. And I certainly remember that. Dr. King changed the face of America in working for fighting for justice and equality. I remember as a young man growing up at the University of Hawaii, I wondered about the United States immigration program based on its discriminatory national origins quota system. And with the growing shift in social and political consciousness led by the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King, about the importance of humanity. Our political consciousness grew and reform became possible in 1965, allowing Asian American communities to grow and settle in the United States. And yes, they are and we are beneficiaries of his legacy. The dreams of Dr. King inspired actions for equality, dignity, and self-respect for everyone who witnessed his work. His words inspired Asian American students like myself in the 60s to exercise our own voice as we spoke up and organized for access to a relevant education. To this day, community leaders look to Dr. King's legacy in the continued fight for equality. But the most important legacy of Dr. King is that many of us can say that his legacy is our legacy, and although he passed away, we can continue it on each and every day. I respectfully ask for your aye vote on ACR 87 to honor the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Thank you, Mr. Ring. Mr. Calderon.
Mr. Speaker, members, I rise just to share a few thoughts. We regularly celebrate the contributions that have been made by individuals in California, of course, nationally, as a case of Martin Luther King. Sometimes it's almost routine, and we forget what the meaning is. But I think now is an appropriate time to recognize his contributions, because he, for the first time, forced us to take a look at ourselves. I remember watching the night that President Obama was elected, and the camera was on Jesse Jackson, and you could see the tears welling up in his eyes at the historical fact that this country had elected, for the first time, a black president. And you could see it in the faces of those Americans who are black, how proud, almost unbelievable in the fact that they were seeing a black person up there as President of the United States. It's appropriate to recognize, however, that many of those states where Martin Luther King demonstrated for equality and for civil rights have enacted laws that have made it more difficult to vote for poor, for black, for others. And I think we need to stay ever vigilant in terms of those contributions and that picture that he showed us of ourselves. Many leaders and great leaders have forfeited their lives for what they believe and for the contributions that they have made. And Jesse Jackson gave his life so that we could be a better country and we could be a better people. I rise in support of this.
Thank you, Mr. Calderon. Ms. Lowenthal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very honored to be a part of this recognition today. And I want to thank the author and the California Legislative Black Caucus for including me in this landmark ceremony. Dr. Martin Luther King, his name, his teachings, and his legacy are woven into the very fabric of our lives. You know, as a Jewish woman growing up in America, I was very aware of the contribution that blacks and Jews made from the time of the founding of the NAACP to erase intolerance. Martin Luther King is not only a national treasure, but a symbol of all that is good in this country, and a sobering lesson in how fiercely the forces of intolerance can strike back from their ignorance and fear. I believe the world would be a worse place if not for the work of Dr. King. And as chair of the Women's Caucus, I note with some pride that it was a woman, Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in December of 1955 and set in motion one of Dr. King's emblematic successes. I can't imagine him having to teach nonviolence to a nation of young people today who spend hours a day on imaginary battlefields on their Xboxes. But you know what? I have no doubt that he would have found a day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support.
Thank you, Ms. Lowenthal. Mr. Alejo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today in honor of a remarkable man who inspired generations of Americans, but also inspired great Latino leaders such as Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and continues to inspire the world today. First of all, I want to just thank my brothers and sisters of the Black Legislative Caucus and the many African-American staff members that do the people's work in these halls of the state legislature. But on this day, it is not enough to just honor Dr. King. We must also remember all the courageous men and women in the civil rights movement who were inspired by Dr. King's eloquence, his moral courage, and who nonviolently stood up for social justice. I'd like to remember people like Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer, Charles Houston, Thurgood Marshall, the Freedom Riders, and the 4 little girls killed in that Birmingham bombing. I want to remember the thousands of others who were jailed, who were beaten, and many who paid an ultimate price to make our country true to its constitutional principle that all are created equal. It was so many ordinary people who did extraordinary things along with Dr. King, including striking down the unjust laws of Jim Crow and the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. They fought to enact landmark legislation like the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965, Affirmative Action, the Fair Housing Act, among many others. These were laws to address the social, economic, and political inequity in our country. And today I'd also like to take a moment to honor my good friend, Bob Fitch of Watsonville, who was a photographer of Dr. King and whose 1966 photograph was used to sculpt the 30-foot statue of Dr. King at the recently dedicated King National Memorial in Washington, D.C. The King Memorial stands as a reminder to our nation to carry Dr. King's legacy of striving for a better tomorrow and a better America. And now more than ever, we need to create and support opportunities for Americans that strengthen our economic security as well. Nationally, a record number of Americans, 1 in 2, have fallen into poverty or are barely scraping by. Here in California, we face one of the widest income gaps in the nation. And our state has also one of the highest dropout rates for students of color in our public high schools. And we have an unacceptably low number of students of color entering our institutions of higher learning, and yet they're overrepresented in our state prisons. So it is time that we re-energize, that we rededicate ourselves and recommit ourselves. That's the best way that we could truly honor this great man. And if Dr. King was here, he would also support the California Dream Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alejo. Mr. Perez.
Good morning, members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just want to share a few words as well. I'm inspired by my colleagues here on the Assembly floor, and thank you, Mr. Bradford, for bringing this resolution forth, as well as the Black Caucus. And everyone here, I think, ultimately does appreciate the legacy of Dr. King for everything that he's done for all of us, whether you're a person of color or not. But as a member of the Latino Caucus and a person of color and the son of immigrant farm workers, I am proud to stand here because I think that was Dr. King's dream as well, is to ensure that one day perhaps all people would have access to the State House and be able to build upon policy and work with the ground and the grassroots to ensure that policy is reflective of the needs of our communities. And so when we think about Dr. King, we also think about his legacy. When we think about his legacy, we think about many concepts that he himself shared throughout his days working for social justice. One concept that comes to mind to me is the concept of the community of man, and how he talked about, and the community of women, and how he talked about the fact that community is dynamic and that community changes. So just because perhaps I grew up in the barrios of Coachella with farm workers, that may be my direct community. But at the same time, the fact is, working here with all of you, this is another community for me. And the fact is, with this community as well as that community, it is my responsibility, it is our responsibility, it is my obligation, it is your obligation, that we figure out ways in which we can work on behalf of all mankind, so that we can work on behalf of womankind, so we can ensure that people have access, so that we can ensure people have opportunities, so that we can ensure that one day there is fairness in our society. And he talked about the fact that we need to sometimes even bend over backwards if that's what we need to do. We need to go that extra mile if that's what we need to do. That is our responsibility if we are fighting for humanity. And he talks about that as well when he discussed social justice. And he defines social justice. What do we mean by social justice? What does that mean to you? Well, it's the opposite of injustice. It is the opposite of the exploitation of one group of people over another. It is the opposite of oppression, of one individual oppressing another individual. And rather than that, it is fairness, it is equality, it is equity, it is access, it is opportunity. And I think that's why we're here, is to ensure that we can bring about social justice and we can bring it closer to our communities. And then he went further and he also talked about economic justice. He also talked about the fact that poor people, the most vulnerable, should also be individuals that we should care for. That as well is our responsibility as we move forward within the realms of the community of man. And economic justice, how he defined it as well, is the distribution of wealth. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that when we're talking about the fact that the middle class is shrinking and we have more and more people becoming poor? And the fact is that we should do everything we can as policymakers to ensure that more people, especially those that are poor, do have opportunity to economic justice. And as we move forward this year, we're going to be making some tough decisions when it comes to the budget. Let's make sure that when we are making these decisions, when it comes to the budget, that we're very thoughtful and mindful about the fact that there are individuals out there, when we make a decision, whether you press the green button or the red button, they will be impacted. And I think it's important that as we move forward, when we talk about the budget, that it is a balanced budget. That it's not only about cuts, it's also about thinking about revenues, especially when we're talking about youth that perhaps today their families cannot pay for their higher education. Or when we're talking about immigrant youth and the fact that perhaps they themselves need an extra hand. Or when we talk about just the most vulnerable, how about our elderly? Ensure that the elderly as well are taken care of. There's so much to discuss when we talk about Dr. King. But I just wanted to say to all of you that it is an honor to be here. And I think we, as legislators, should continue to fight for justice. That is our role here. That is my role here. And I just want to say thank you, Mr. Bradford and the Black Caucus, for bringing this resolution forth.
Thank you, Mr. Perez. Ms. Yamada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise to also support this discussion and this resolution today, but I wanted to bring this back home to our chambers and share permission to refer to a photograph, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Thank you. Members, I have had this photo in my office since I took office in December of 2008. It's a little bit of history because as we in the nation celebrate the 26th anniversary of the national holiday of Martin Luther King, I want to remind all of us here that 31 years ago, California was the first state in the nation to recognize the Martin Luther King birthday as a special recognition. And in this photo that I have with me is a picture of a familiar face to us now. It is the former Governor Jerry Brown in 1981, and now we have current Governor Jerry Brown. And with him is Elihu Harris, Willie Brown, Milton Marks, David Roberti, Teresa Hughes, whom we just eulogized on Wednesday at the Black Caucus Breakfast, and others. And I just wanted to remind us that 31 years ago, California was a leader at the vanguard of social justice, of social change, environmental protection, all of the issues that should bind us together here today. And that all of the words that have been shared with us already this morning, I'm sure Dr. King would be very pleased to know that despite his tragic death on April 4th, 1968, that his life and legacy continue to motivate us to continue, this long journey to justice that I think all of us have been on in one way or another throughout all of our lives. Despite which party we're in, despite what our beliefs are, we are all on this same path together. So, members, I just wanted to share this with you. I'll have this at my desk if anyone wants to take a look. But that, California and this chamber has been a leader before. It's time to reset that alarm clock so that we can wake up to a brighter tomorrow. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Ms. Yamada. Ms. Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in strong support of ACR 87, and I think it's important that we remember one of the benefits of this day is not just a day off of work, but it is that school children throughout the state reflect on the impact that Dr. Martin Luther King made. And my own son this week was having to do art projects and write essays about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And one of the things, as I sat with him, and he said, I don't know what to write. I said, well, what struck you as you were learning in class about what he had done? What do you remember about what he had done? And he said, I remember that he was assassinated when he was only 39 years old, the same age as his mother. And it struck him how young he really was and how big of an impact he had made in society, even though he wasn't here until he was 50, 60 years old. But he was only 39. And I think it's important for us to remember the impact that has on our children as we take this day off and we reflect on the impacts one man made. What a big difference all these children can make in their lives having learned about this man. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Huber. Mr. Wessel.
Thank you. I also rise in support of ACR 87. This is a wonderful resolution that brings some much-needed attention to issues that we're still confronting here today. We're coming very close to the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, yes, yet we still have a lot of challenges in our own community to reach the kind of equality that is so important to create a truly democratic society. We often talk about how we, the United States, are ambassadors to the world on democracy and how we promote democracy as a very important form of government and how more nations in the world should be democratic. Yet, our communities still lack the fundamental access to true equality for all our citizens in ways that contradict what we stand for as a nation. We still have government agencies that do not have equal representation, or at least that reflects the population or the ethnic makeup of our community. Why is that so? We're still trying, as people from the Hispanic community, to gain that kind of representation. People from the African American community still trying to gain the representation in all systems of our representation, all systems of justice. We still lack a percentage of African American judges in our court system that's truly reflective of our community, of Asians, of Hispanics, of all walks of ethnic makeup in our community. Why is that so? Why do we have a system that continues to favor one group or another, or one community or over another? That's something I hope that we can work on This ACR not only recognizes someone that was truly effective at creating civil rights improvements in our community, but also somebody that never stopped fighting for change. His work did not end when the Civil Rights Act was approved. He continued to work and inform people that there was still a lot of work to do. And I hope that we can take that message and incorporate it into our work and remember that it took legislation to get people to change their practices, and that we're going to have to continue to address some of these changes through legislation. I hope that we can all work together to really ensure that we can create that kind of community in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wesso. Ms. Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. I also stand in support of ACR 87. And as we reflect on King's legacy and prepare ourselves this weekend for the various events in his honor in our districts, I always think, and especially now, about the two things towards the end of his life that were the focus of his work. One, peace. As many of us know, Dr. King became a very strong advocate against the Vietnam War and against the use of American resources in what he felt was a misguided war. It brought some of the most controversy and anger towards him, really. Also, he focused very, very much on workers' rights. And at the point that he was assassinated, he was in Memphis because the garbage workers, who were almost 100% African American, had been locked out. And those garbage workers did not even make minimum wage. I think it's very important to reflect on it now with what I feel is a very unfortunate kind of attack on public employees, and a kind of view somehow that public employees are enriched far beyond private sector and somehow get benefits that are well beyond what is deserved, when we know, both from the time of, well, certainly public employees' circumstances have been bettered since Dr. King's, but we still have a situation where public employees, on average, make a lower wage than private sector and or play a very, very, very important role for all of our society's benefit. So I think that in his honor for his respect for, recognition, and real understanding of their role and their deserving of appropriate wages and benefits, I stand in his honor.
Thank you, Ms. Skinner. Dr. Halderman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April 4th, 1968, my parents were in Memphis, Tennessee. I was also, but because I wasn't born for another 2 months, I don't have any recollections of that day, but my parents do, and they told me often what it was like when their car was stopped and the police informed them that they needed to get out of Memphis, that Dr. King had been killed, and that they weren't safe. And to them, this was a heartbreak. It confused me at first when I heard about this because I knew that there were very big differences between my parents and Dr. King. For example, Dr. King's family were lifelong Republicans, as was he. My parents were Kennedy Democrats. Dr. King was a Christian pastor. My parents were Jews. But what my parents explained to me was that for Dr. King, racism, inequality against anyone was the same as racism and inequality against everyone. He was strongly pro-Israel. And so it was people like my parents and many hundreds of thousands of others who, although they themselves were not oppressed by racism, they understood and they supported what his dream was, which is that the color of our skin isn't top priority. Our gender identity, not our top priority. Our religion. It's the content of our character, and that's a great lesson, I know, for me in my life, and I'm grateful to have at least a small connection to that history. I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Dr. Holderman. Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I rise in support of ACR 87, which commemorates one of the greatest people in American history, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Much has been said about this great man, most of which we already know. He has been honored with a national holiday and now his own national memorial. He has been rightly lionized as a champion of freedom and justice. Sometimes it is easy to forget that Dr. King was a human being like all of us. He had his fears and frustrations, which I think should be instructive to all who seek justice. One story in particular stands out to me when I think of Dr. King. During evening in one of his darkest days of the civil rights movement, Dr. King came home to be with his family. He was asleep from an exhausting day leading the Montgomery bus boycott. He was awakened suddenly by a mysterious phone call that threatened his life. Burdened with great worry about his family's safety, Dr. King bowed and prayed out loud. He prayed, "Lord, I am taking a stand for what I believe is right. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I can't face it alone." According to Dr. King's wife, that prayer gave him peace. Faced with the seemingly hopeless situation, with the hatred that he was facing, the prayer renewed Dr. King's resolve. Instead of giving up or giving in to his fears, he carried on the fight. And he carried on that fight nonviolently and with the utmost courage. We know that there is still work to be done to realize his dream, where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. His example gave others the courage to face their fears. He taught us that sometimes you just have to step back and do a simple thing: pray. His example teaches us that we can't do everything alone, no matter how righteous the cause. Having faith in God and with the people he worked with, Dr. King successfully reminded America that we were founded on the principle that we are all created equal. I don't know what history would have been like if he had given up when he was at his most vulnerable, but America is thankful that he didn't. His faith was renewed, and the rest is history. I am honored to join all of you today in commemorating his life. Perhaps there is no greater tribute that we can do to pay Dr. King than to look around this chamber and see who is here. People of all colors and backgrounds are here, united in honoring a great man. I ask for your vote on this resolution.
Thank you, Ms. Conway. Mr. Bradford, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleagues who have lent their voice to this discussion of honoring a great man, a great civil rights icon. And as we begin this legislative year and we start debating and voting on bills, let's embrace the tenets and the thoughts and the principles of Dr. King, that of equality and justice, that of assisting the impoverished, that of making sure equal opportunity for employment exists for each and every one of us, and again, that voting rights are afforded to all Californians, all Americans. I'm reminded of a comment that Dr. King once stated: morals cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. The law cannot make the employer love me, but it can keep him from refusing to give me a job because of the color of my skin. We deal with those issues still today, and we must remember that. We all have a story. We've all been impacted. So as we celebrate on Monday, let's not just celebrate, let's not just remember, let's stand up, let's be active, because Dr. King would want us to stand up, he would want us to speak up, and if necessary, he might want us to act up, to make sure that justice of this world would flow down like a rolling stream. My favorite quote by Dr. King is, "The ultimate test of a man is not where he stands in comfort and convenience, but where he stands in challenge and controversy." we as members of the California legislature face major challenges and controversy. I ask for your aye vote, and I ask for the roll to be left open for co-authors. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing and hearing no further debate, we will move on to a vote. The first vote is for co-authors. The first vote is for co-authors. The clerk will open the roll. All members vote who desire to vote. All members vote who desire to vote. Close the roll. Close the roll. Tally the vote. We have 63 co-authors added. Our final roll call is on the bill. We can take up a voice vote on this. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. I'd like to thank the Legislative Black Caucus and Mr. Bradford for bringing this important resolution for the Assembly's observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This concludes our ceremony, and we'll move on with the regular order of business. Second reading. Clerk will read.
Senate Bill 1047, 662, 1253, 1199, 42 with amendments, 510
All
with amendments,
bills will be
1378.
deemed read and amendments deemed adopted. Items on concurrence. Items on concurrence, there are none. Reconsideration is continued. Assembly third reading. We will pass and retain. We're on the second day consent calendar. Does any member wish to remove an item from the second day consent calendar? Seeing and hearing none, the clerk will read.
Senate Bill 1165 by Senator Sajjan, an act relating to domestic violence.
Clerk will open the roll on the consent calendar. All members vote who desire to vote. 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 Close the roll. Tally the vote. Ayes 63, noes 0.
Senate Bill 1354.
Ayes 63, noes 0. This concludes the business on the daily file. We'll now move to announcements and adjourn in memories. Under announcements, we will meet in joint convention with the Senate on Wednesday, January 18th, for the purpose of hearing Governor Edmund G. Brown's 2012 State of the State Address. Floor session will begin at 9:30 a.m. The governor will deliver his address at 10 a.m. Schedule: Monday, January 16th, holiday for the Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Tuesday, January 17th, floor session at 12 noon. Wednesday, January 18th, floor session at 9:30 a.m., followed by the Joint Convention and State of the State Address. Thursday, January 19th, floor session at 9 a.m. All other items will be passed and retained. All motions shall be continued. We will now move on to adjourn in memories. Before we do that, by unanimous consent, we'll return to motions and resolutions. Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we spent today honoring Dr. Martin Luther King, a great man, and a friend of ours, someone who has worked with us and for us for 30 years. I want it to let go without notice. I believe he doesn't want to be noticed, but he's always there for us. And I think we would be remiss in our duty if we did not acknowledge and thank Mr. Brent Ashita. Let's all look at him. I know you didn't want this. He's retiring. Today is his last day. He thought he was going to sneak out of here without us noticing it. Brent, we appreciate you and we thank you. and we wish you well in whatever's next for you. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking him. Thanks. You almost got away with it, but we caught you.
Okay. We are now moving on to request to adjourn in memory. Mr. Alejo.
Mr. Speaker and members, it's with a heavy heart that I respectfully request that we adjourn in memory today in honor of my good friend, Barney Brickmont, a respected former colleague of mine on the Santa Cruz County Democratic Central Committee, who was a dedicated civic leader. Barney was an advocate for organic farming his entire life, and he was one of the founders of the California Certified Organic Farmers, and he started the very first farmers market on California's Central Coast in 1975. He also worked closely with the then Assembly member Sam Farr on the California Organic Foods Act of 1979. In addition to organic farming, Barney had a passion for literacy and education, and he was elected to the Live Oak School Board in 1975, where he served for more than 3 decades. Barney was a tireless advocate for schools and his community. He served on the California School Boards Association, the boards of Schools Plus Foundation, and the Cultural Council of Santa Cruz County. He was also an active member of the Friends of the Library. Barney passed away on December 6th of last year and is survived by his daughter, Nicole. Today, we pause for this prolific leader and honor him for his contributions to organic farming, his community, and his country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alejo. Ms. Galgiati.
I rise today to adjourn in memory of Florencia Lagman Zambrano of Tracy, who passed away on December 30th, 2011. Ms. Zambrano was born on March 6, 1922, in the Philippines to Rufina and Gregorio Lagman. She was married to Buenaventura Zambrano and had 4 children, Gregorio, Rodolfo, Buenaventura, and Elizabeth. Florencia worked as a school teacher in the Philippines from 1944 until 1962, when she migrated to the United States. I respectfully request that we adjourn in her memory, and now I would like to offer my colleague, Assemblymember Felipe Fuentes, an opportunity to speak to this adjourned in memory, as he had a personal connection to Ms. Zambrano. Thank you.
Mr. Fuentes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, ask that we adjourn in the memory of Florencia Lagman Zambrano. She came to the United States in 1962, and she found work as a migrant farm worker, helping her bring her 4 children to the United States in 1965. She retired in 1983, settling in the Northern California cities of Sacramento, Fremont, and Tracy with her children in order to help raise her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. Florencia leaves a lasting legacy and will be loved and remembered for her strong and unconditional love for her family. This is a sad loss for 2 members of our Capitol family, Beth DeCumis, a longtime Capitol staffer and member of my staff, and Aaron DeCumis Kana, whose hard work with the Chief Clerk's office enables us to do what we do every day. Florencia is survived by her 4 children and her nephews, 15 grandchildren, 24 great-grandchildren, and her 2 great-great-grandchildren. I ask that we adjourn in her memory today.
Thank you. Mr. Monning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today to ask that we adjourn in memory of Scott Kennedy, the former 2-term mayor and 11-year member of the Santa Cruz City Council, who died suddenly in November at the age of 62. Scott was a founding member and director of the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz in 1976 and led the center's Middle East peace programs. Scott first became active in the cause of Middle East peace in his late teens when his brother-in-law, the late Bishop James Pike, disappeared while on a Middle East visit. Over the years, Scott led more than 40 delegations to Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East region, during which he built a strong network of Palestinian and Israeli friends and allies. Scott's Middle East peace work was recognized when he was awarded the prestigious Pfeffer Peace Prize by the National Fellowship of Reconciliation in 2010. Scott Kennedy was a man who definitely walked the talk. He was a war resistor and refused to pay war taxes during the Vietnam War, for which he was prosecuted and sentenced to community service. He never shied away from paying the price of being an activist. He saw it as part of the territory within which he had chosen to walk and sometimes to march. As a community leader, Scott supported a nuclear-free Santa Cruz, the United Farm Workers Union and the right of farm workers to organize, and the struggles for peace and human rights in Central America in the 1980s. Within the city, Scott championed completion of the city's Greenbelt, the establishment of youth soccer fields, promotion of affordable housing, reconstruction of the downtown after the 1989 earthquake, and establishment of a police review commission. It's indeed appropriate that we memorialize and adjourn in memory of Scott Kennedy on the day that we memorialize and celebrate the life of Martin Luther King. Scott Kennedy was a soldier in the March for Justice and Peace. He's survived by his wife, Kristen, and 3 children. Members, thank you for adjourning in the memory of Scott Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Monning. Mr. Hagman. Mr. Williams.
Colleagues, on behalf of Assemblymember Gurel, I would ask you today to adjourn in the memory of Sergio Raul Mendez Burgos, a resident of Fillmore in Ventura County and a Marine veteran who died at the young age of 30 on December 13th when a sports utility vehicle drove through a local Starbucks, which Mr. Mendez frequented regularly. He served in the Marines from 2002 to 2006 and was deployed into Iraq in 2003. He was also a member of the California National Guard and a caregiver for local sick, or someone who's deathly sick in Fillmore. A private first class, Mendez was a motor vehicle mechanic primarily stationed at Camp Pendleton. During his time in the Marines, Mendez received awards including a Combat Action Ribbon and a Presidential Unit Citation. Mr. Mendez leaves behind his wife, Cynthia, and young relatives for whom the couple was caring for. I respectfully request that we adjourn in the memory of Mr. Sergio Raul Mendez Burgos.
Thank you. Ms. Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I stand to adjourn in memory for 2 individuals in my district. First, I was really sorry to hear about the death of Giselle Wainwright Thomas, a woman that was a staffer for the Berkeley City Council during the years that I served on the council. A longtime Berkeley resident, born and raised there, the wife of one of our Berkeley firefighters, and also the administrator for one of our Montessori schools. Giselle met her husband, Lucky Thomas, our firefighter, at UC Berkeley. She was an avid traveler and, as I mentioned, a dedicated administrator and board director for the Montessori Family School, and passed away just last week, survived by her husband, Lucky, her son, Lucky Thomas IV, her daughters, Summer Thomas Weathers and Morgan Thomas, and her mother and other siblings and grandchildren, and we definitely grieve in her passing. The other person I ask you to join me in adjourn in memory is George Livingston. George Livingston was the first person to serve as African-American mayor of Richmond. City of Richmond, as many of you may know, really grew during the era of World War II, when so many of our African-American residents from all over the U.S. came to California to work in the shipyards. So the city of Richmond at that time grew greatly in population, but also, as many cities in California, had property restrictions, deed restrictions, where African-Americans could not own property. So it was both unusual for African Americans to serve in city government, but ever to be considered to be elected as mayors. George was first elected in 1965, served on the City Council for a very long time, was not elected to be mayor until 1985, and served in that position until 1993. He came from rural Oklahoma, and as I mentioned, moved to work in the shipyards. He graduated from Berkeley High School, got his political science degree from Antioch College. He was active in many church, fraternal, and neighborhood groups, and was a leader that Richmond will miss greatly. Among other achievements, he founded the East Bay Safety Corridor with then Mayor Lonnie Hancock. We will miss George greatly. He is survived by his wife Eunice, his son George Jr., and his daughter Grace.
Thank you, Ms. Skinner. Members, please bring the names to the desk to be printed in the journal. This concludes our business for the day. I'm ready to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Allen moves, Mr. Hagman seconds, that this House stand adjourned until Tuesday, January 17th at 12 noon. The quorum call is lifted.